600 miles. That's the distance between the geographic North Pole and the magnetic North Pole. And it's exactly why a normal compass becomes completely useless the moment a plane crosses into this region. For decades, this single detail turned one of the shortest routes on the entire planet into one of the most avoided. It seems like something as simple as flying in a straight line over the top of the world should be easy. But the closer you get to the pole, the more the basic rules of navigation start to break down entirely. And the strangest part of this story is that almost everything people assume about flying over the North Pole is wrong. Today, you'll see the real reason these routes were avoided for so long, what changed, and why one pole on this planet is still almost completely off limits to commercial aircraft. Have you ever looked at a flight tracker and noticed a plane flying from New York to Hong Kong curving strangely far north, almost grazing the Arctic? It looks like a mistake on a flat map. It isn't. Planes don't fly the straight line you see on an atlas. They fly great circle routes, the shortest path between 2 points on a sphere. And on a globe, that path often bends directly toward the pole. For a flight between major cities in North America and Asia, cutting across the Arctic can shave off hundreds of miles and save enormous amounts of fuel. So if the geometry works and the fuel savings are real, why did it take until the late 1990s for airlines to actually use this shortcut on a daily basis? The first problem shows up the moment a plane gets close enough to the pole for its instruments to start behaving strangely. Standard aircraft compasses rely on Earth's magnetic field, and near the poles, that field points almost straight down into the ground instead of pointing north. A compass in this region doesn't just become inaccurate. It can spin, oscillate, or lock onto a direction that has nothing to do with where the plane is actually heading. Modern airliners solve this with inertial reference systems and satellite navigation, calculating position using motion sensors and GPS instead of magnetism, and switching their charts from magnetic bearings to true north bearings the moment they cross into this zone. But for most of aviation history, this technology simply didn't exist, and pilots who attempted transpolar flights had to navigate almost entirely on dead reckoning, with no reliable way to correct their course if something went wrong. And something going wrong up here comes with a second, much stranger problem. This far north, ordinary radio communication starts to fail. The polar upper atmosphere behaves differently than the rest of the planet, and during periods of solar activity, it can absorb high-frequency radio signals almost completely, cutting a plane off from the ground for extended stretches. Air traffic controllers call this a polar cap absorption event, and when one is detected, polar flights are sometimes rerouted hundreds of miles south just to stay in radio contact. Combine that with satellite navigation signals that can also degrade near the poles during solar storms, and you get a region where a plane can, for a period of time, lose both its most reliable form of communication and part of its navigation accuracy at the same moment. But the detail that surprises almost everyone isn't a mechanical failure at all. It's what's happening to the people on board. At the cruising altitudes used on polar routes, the atmosphere thins out enough that cosmic radiation from deep space penetrates far more easily than it does over the equator. Passengers flying these routes occasionally are exposed to a small, harmless increase in radiation, but pilots and flight attendants who fly these routes regularly are classified differently. International radiation guidelines treat them as occupationally exposed workers, the same category used for people who work around medical imaging equipment, and airlines are required to track their cumulative yearly dose. It's a strange thought. Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, the crew serving your coffee is quietly being monitored for radiation exposure, in a job that, on paper, doesn't look anything like nuclear work. None of this even addresses the most basic safety question of all. What happens if an engine fails, or a passenger has a medical emergency in the middle of this route? Over most of the planet, planes stay within a set flying distance of an airport capable of handling an emergency landing. Over the Arctic, that safety net had to be built almost from nothing. Today, a specific set of certified diversion airports keeps polar flights covered. Places like Reykjavik in Iceland, Anchorage and Fairbanks in Alaska, Iqaluit in northern Canada, and a handful of airfields scattered across the Russian Arctic. Airlines flying these routes need special government approval just to operate here, with detailed plans for exactly which airport a plane would divert to at every point along the route, and contingency plans for what happens if the weather at that airport suddenly turns unflyable. This entire safety framework didn't come from caution alone. It came from decades of people testing the limits of what was possible up here, sometimes at a devastating cost. In 1897, Swedish engineer Salomon Andrée attempted. That risk didn't disappear once commercial aviation caught up with the technology. It simply moved to the opposite end of the planet. Because here's the twist almost nobody expects. The North Pole isn't the pole that remains largely closed to commercial flights today. It's the South Pole. Antarctica has almost no certified airports capable of handling an emergency landing, no meaningful infrastructure, and weather conditions that can turn lethal with almost no warning. In 1979, an Air New Zealand sightseeing flight carrying 257 people crashed directly into the side of a 12,000-foot volcanic mountain near the edge of the continent, killing. But even this modern success story isn't permanent. After 2022, the closure of Russian airspace forced many of these routes to shift west or curve even further north to avoid it, adding extra flying time and fuel that airlines had spent decades trying to eliminate. And overhead, the sun itself keeps interfering. As solar activity peaks and cycles, geomagnetic storms and radiation events regularly force airlines to abandon the polar shortcut entirely, rerouting flights hundreds of miles south until the storm passes. The shortest path across the top of the world, it turns out, was never really about distance. It was about how much uncertainty a modern aircraft and the people flying it are willing to accept just to save a few hours in the air.